My dad sold my $3 million cottage without telling me. Then he handed me a $12,000 check and said, "Go live far away from here." I just laughed. He had no idea what I had done a few days earlier. The knock came just after noon, when the lake lay still under the pale winter sky and the bare birches stood like sentinels at the edge of the yard. I opened the door to find my father on the porch, shoulders squared as if he were bringing good news. His hands, once roughened by years hauling traps out of Penobscot Bay, now trembled faintly as he reached into his coat pocket. He laid the envelope on my kitchen table with a flourish, as though he were presenting a gift. A cashier's check slid out, its neat type announcing $12,000. "There," he said, settling into the chair across from me, "enough for you to start over. You can find a place in Portland, maybe even Boston. The cottage is spoken for now. $3 million cash offer." It was the smart thing to do. I kept my eyes on the check, my fingers resting lightly on the steel key I wore on a cord around my neck. The air between us carried the faint smell of his cologne, too sharp for the room. "You sold the cottage," I said, my voice steady. "You've been too busy to manage it," he replied quickly, his tone dressed up in reasonableness. "You're running jobs all over the coast, working yourself to the bone. I saved you from drowning in responsibility. This way you can be free." I let him talk. He mistook my silence for resignation, a small smile curling his mouth. He spoke of investments, of a buyer eager to renovate, of how generous it was to hand me a check instead of leaving me with nothing. What he did not know was that I had sat in Claire Wynn's office in Rockland only 3 days earlier, signing documents that transferred the cottage into an irrevocable trust. What he did not know was that a fraud alert already sat on file at the Knox County Registry of Deeds, waiting like a tripwire. I lifted the check, turned it once in my hand, and set it back on the table. My father leaned back, certain he had won. I rose from my chair and walked to the window, the lake stretching out in silence, the pines unmoved by his schemes. I breathed slowly, gathering the composure that had carried me through harder storms. When I turned back, I smiled. And that was the moment he should have realized he had stepped into a story already written by someone else. The next chapter of that story began with a whisper carried from a Rockport bar. After my father left that afternoon, the cottage fell into the kind of silence that carries memory in its walls. I sat at the table, the check still lying where he had placed it, and thought of the winters that had passed since my mother's death. I was 24 then, old enough to know what loss felt like but too young to understand how permanent it would be. The probate judge signed the papers transferring the cottage to me, a formality that felt less like inheritance and more like a sentence. My father had already grown restless, his attention drifting toward quick ventures and whispered promises of easy money. I stayed. Someone had to. The cottage had been falling in on itself, roof shingles curling, windows swollen with rot, floors sagging where water crept in. I worked jobs in Camden during the day and came back to strip wallpaper, replace joists, and sand floorboards at night. My hands toughened, my back learned the ache of labor, but I kept going. Each repaired beam was a line of dialogue between my mother and me, one I wasn't willing to forget. Through those years my father's calls came steady. He needed bridge loans, cash for a truck repair, help covering late mortgage payments on a house in Belfast he swore he could flip. I said yes too often. I told myself it was family duty, that if I refused he'd spiral into ruin. In truth, part of me believed control equaled safety if I kept the purse strings. I could prevent disaster, but control has a cost. Every dollar I sent his way pulled me further into silence, a silence where I didn't ask why he needed so much, didn't press for promises I knew he'd never keep. I became the steady wall he leaned against, even as the weight of it bent me. The cottage, though, never betrayed me. Each winter I stoked the wood stove, watched the snow gather against the stone steps, and reminded myself that this house was proof I could endure. Still, endurance is not the same as freedom. It was Owen who reminded me of that, with a whisper carried from a Rockport bar. It was Owen who broke the silence. He called late in the evening, his voice carrying the unease of someone who wished he didn't have to speak. He told me he'd been at a marina bar in Rockport, half listening to the chatter over cheap whiskey, when my father's voice cut through. Ronan had been bragging to anyone who'd listened that the lake place would be gone within the week, a deal already lined up, money as good as in his pocket. Owen paused, as if unsure whether to go on, then added the part that made my chest tighten. My father told the table I was too naive to notice a signature slipped under my hand. He laughed when he said it. That laughter, even second-hand, felt like a blade. By morning, I was sitting in Claire Wynn's office in Rockland. Claire had been recommended to me years ago, but I'd never had cause to call. She greeted me with a measured calm that steadied my own pulse. I laid out the story, the debts, the check on my table, Owen's warning. She listened without interruption, then leaned forward and told me plainly a forged power of attorney was already in motion. If we didn't act, the county could record a deed before I ever knew it existed. We moved quickly. Claire prepared the documents transferring the cottage into an irrevocable trust, naming me lifetime beneficiary and trustee. I signed each page with deliberate strokes, aware of the weight in my hand. She also drafted a fraud alert affidavit for the Knox County Registry of Deeds. That filing, she explained, would act as a tripwire any attempt to slip a forged document through would trigger review. As I walked out of her office, the cold Rockland air hit my face with the force of certainty. I had finally drawn a line that no one, not even my father, could cross. That certainty carried me home, where preparation became my only language. The days after my meeting with Claire moved with a strange rhythm, each hour split between waiting and working. I wanted proof, not just suspicion, so I filled the cottage with quiet witnesses, small cameras tucked above the doorway, in the kitchen rafters, in the office where my father liked to spread papers across the desk. Their red lights blinked only for me, tiny beacons of resolve. Claire arranged for a handwriting expert in Portland to review samples I'd saved, old tax forms, my mother's will, letters I'd signed for insurance claims, side by side with the supposed power of attorney. The forgeries betrayed themselves, loops too shallow, pressure uneven, a signature crafted by someone who thought practice could replace intimacy. Meanwhile, Claire traced the bank activity linked to the buyer. The account led to a man I remembered from childhood cookouts, one of my father's poker companions from Warren. Money shuffled between them in restless movements, small deposits, sudden withdrawals, then silence. It was less a business transaction than a shell game, and the pieces were already falling out of his hands. Marta LeClaire at the Registry of Deeds called Claire late one evening. She had flagged a packet dropped after hours, documents that looked rushed, signatures that made her frown. She promised they would not slip through unnoticed. In her steady voice, I heard the kind of quiet allyship that cannot be bought. Owen offered to come by, to help with the cameras or simply to sit with me through the waiting. I told him no. Control felt safer than company, and I convinced myself I needed to steer every detail alone. His disappointment was soft but audible before he hung up. I hated myself a little for it, but I could not let anyone touch the edges of my plan. By the time my father called to invite me to dinner, I was ready to let the stage set itself. The Summit Grill sat on the waterfront, glass windows framing the breakwater light against a pale horizon. My father had chosen it with the flourish of a man celebrating victory. When I arrived, he was already at the table, a bottle of wine chilling in its bucket, menus spread out like props in a play. "Sit down, Sable," he said, his voice full of cheer. "This is a night for goodbyes but also for beginnings. You'll see." I took my seat, folding the napkin across my lap as if nothing in me trembled. He poured 2 glasses of wine, raising his in a toast. "To your freedom," he said. "No more carrying that place alone. I've relieved you of the burden." I let my glass touch his, though I didn't drink. He leaned back, satisfaction lighting his face. "You should be thanking me. $3 million isn't a bad price. I've secured our future and the 12,000. That's my way of making sure you land on your feet." The words slid over me like ice. He wanted me grateful for being cut out of my own life. Instead, I smiled faintly, the expression he mistook for surrender. Halfway through the meal, Claire walked in. She pretended surprise when she spotted me, asked if she might join us. My father's brows rose, but he gestured politely to the empty chair. He still believed he held every card. As the waiter cleared our plates, he began to talk more freely, perhaps emboldened by the wine. His voice grew softer, edged with something raw. "You know, Sable, your mother always favored you, even in her will. That house should have been mine by rights. I built the dock, repaired the roof, paid the taxes when she couldn't, and what did the judge do? Handed it all to you like I was some afterthought." I watched him carefully. Beneath the swagger lay the wound that drove every scheme. He hadn't just sold the cottage he had been trying to erase, the slight he believed my mother carved into stone the day probate ended. Claire caught my eye and gave the smallest nod. The mask was slipping, the stage was nearly set for the truth that would break him open. The moment arrived sooner than I expected when the dinner shifted from performance to trial. The waiter set down fresh glasses of wine and Claire leaned forward, her tone almost conversational. "Ronan, I happened to stop by the registry this week. Interesting timing on some documents filed under your name." His fork paused mid-air. "What documents?" She reached into her bag and slid a folder across the table. Inside lay copies of the trust filings, stamped and dated 3 days before. "This cottage is no longer vulnerable to your signatures. It belongs to an irrevocable trust with Sable as lifetime beneficiary. Any deed attempted afterward is void." My father's face darkened. He rifled through the pages as though disbelief might undo the ink. "You can't do this to me." I already had a buyer. Claire's voice was calm, clinical. The so-called buyer is linked to a shell account in Warren, tied directly to one of your poker acquaintances. Funds never cleared escrow. If you represent it otherwise, that qualifies as fraud. He slammed the folder shut. You think you're clever, but I poured years into that property. Paid bills when your mother couldn't. Sable owes me. I felt the words burn, but I kept my composure. I don't owe you theft. He leaned closer, lowering his voice as if secrets could save him. You don't understand. I'm drowning. Thomaston lenders are breathing down my neck. I can't walk the harbor without someone reminding me of my debts. Selling that place was my chance to stay afloat. Claire's expression hardened. And forging a signature, exploiting your own daughter under Maine law, that's document fraud, attempted theft by deception, and financial exploitation of a family member. The district attorney could press charges tomorrow. For a moment, the swagger drained out of him. His eyes darted toward the window where the lighthouse blinked against the darkening sky. Then he straightened, summoning a last defense. So what now? You going to drag me off in handcuffs? Not yet, Claire said. Prosecutors often weigh restitution. If you begin repayment, if you cooperate, it may affect how charges are pursued. But make no mistake, your exposure is real, and the clock has already started. Silence settled between us, thick as the tide outside. He shifted in his chair, suddenly smaller, and I realized this dinner was no farewell. It was the first hearing of his reckoning. The real terms would be set in the days that followed, when boundaries had to be written in ink. The morning after the dinner, I drove back to Claire's office with the tide still low along the Rockland shore. The file from the night before lay open on her desk, its pages marked with yellow tabs. She asked what outcome I wanted, her tone steady, her eyes searching for the line I was willing to draw. I don't want this swept under the rug, I said, but I also don't want to see him in an orange jumpsuit if there's another way. Claire nodded, already drafting. We would initiate civil action, not to punish but to preserve leverage. At the same time, she outlined a restitution framework. Ronan would begin repayments from whatever assets he could liquidate, attend mandatory financial counseling, and sign a covenant forbidding him from contacting me about the property or attempting to interfere with the trust. Any breach would trigger both the civil case and the criminal referral waiting in the wings. When I explained this to Owen over coffee in Camden, he frowned into his mug. Do you realize what this will do to him? He'll say we're destroying him, not saving him. I looked at my cousin, weary of the balance I had to hold. Maybe both can be true. I can't ignore what he tried to take from me, but I'm not blind to what it means to prosecute your own father. The admission left a taste of ash in my mouth. I feared the weight of public disgrace, feared that even justified steps might sever something beyond repair, but I also knew silence would only invite another attempt. Owen pressed his lips together, then finally nodded. If this is what keeps you safe, I'll stand with you. It was a fragile kind of peace, one that steadied me as I prepared to set every lock on my life. Back at the cottage, I began with the locks. New hardware gleamed against the old pine doors. Each turn of the wrench a reminder that control could be practical, not just symbolic. I walked to the shoreline afterward, marking the places where erosion had crept closer. Under Maine DP rules, I installed low stone buffers and native plantings, building a quiet defense against forces older and more patient than any family quarrel. Inside, I hung 2 frames above the mantel. One held my mother's original deed, the paper yellowed, but still legible in her careful script. The other displayed the new trust certificate, crisp and formal, proof that the cottage's story had not ended with betrayal. Together, they told a lineage of survival. Ronan tried to slip through anyway. He called Owen, spinning the same tired lines about family loyalty, about how I had been poisoned against him. Owen told me later he listened, but this time he didn't bend. If you want to talk about money or the house, he said to Ronan, do it through Claire. Hearing that gave me a relief so sharp it nearly felt like grief. At my next meeting with Claire, I found myself confessing what I hadn't dared name. The more I tighten things, the more alone I feel. I admitted, I keep thinking if I control every hinge and every dollar, nothing can touch me, but it leaves no room for anyone else to stand beside me. Claire closed the file gently. Safety matters, she said, but walls can turn into cages if you never open the gate. Her words lingered with me long after I left, carrying into the last weeks of summer when Camden's streets grew crowded with visitors and the air hinted at change. By late August, Camden's streets pulsed with tourists, the farmers' market filled with crates of blueberries and jars of honey, Harbor Park overflowed with families listening to music by the bay, the rhythm of a town that looked untouched by private wars like mine. Ronan had begun restitution under Claire's supervision. The payments were small, clipped from the wages he earned repairing boats in Owl's Head, but they came on time. I kept each receipt in a folder, not for revenge, but because the record mattered more than his promises ever had. I needed my own act of repair, one that stretched beyond bloodlines, so I set up a small grant through a local land trust designed to help homeowners fight deed fraud. A few applications arrived within weeks, people with stories too familiar, signatures questioned, neighbors coerced. For the first time in months, I felt my vigilance building something rather than only guarding against loss. Then a letter came in Ronan's hand, unadorned and plain, no apologies, no excuses, just a single request to stand at the road and look at the cottage once more. I carried the letter to the lake, read it on the granite steps where my mother used to sit. The request was modest compared to the damage done, and yet it stirred something complicated. After days of weighing, I allowed it one visit, supervised, from the gravel shoulder beyond the gate. When he came, he kept his distance. He looked at the roof lines, the stone chimney, the birches shifting in the late summer breeze. His face was unreadable, but his silence was the closest thing to respect I had ever received from him. By September, I understood the future would be written in boundaries, not bargains. A year passed in measured increments, marked not by drama but by steady, deliberate steps. Each month, Claire sent me updates: Ronan's partial compliance, small payments logged, counseling sessions attended. None of it erased what he had done, but it carved a rhythm of accountability I could live with. When I met Claire in her Rockland office, she spread the file across the desk. "He's meeting the terms," she said. "Not perfectly, but consistently, enough to keep the civil action in abeyance." I nodded. It was not forgiveness I felt, nor the hollow ache of unresolved anger. It was something quieter, the recognition that I could not fix him, only fix the lines he once crossed. Back at the cottage, the air carried the first bite of autumn. I had prepared a shadow box for the mantel. Inside, I placed three things: the steel key I had worn around my neck, the trust certificate with Claire's crisp filing stamp, and the photograph of the cottage my mother had taken the summer before she died. Together, they told a story of survival, of what was nearly taken and what had been reclaimed. I stood back and studied the display. The key no longer needed to rest against my skin. It belonged there, behind glass, as both artifact and promise. The cottage breathed with its own quiet life around me, its walls no longer trembling under threat. Outside, the birches swayed, and the lake caught the light like polished glass. My father's shadow lingered somewhere beyond the gate, but he no longer stood inside. That boundary was mine to keep, and I intended to hold it. The story of the cottage was not over. It was simply, finally, mine.